the people online can actually hear and see us, because I can't see it on according to this screen. Fantastic. Okay, and as we with respect to the discussants, because now we're going to focus on the issues of socio-economic change and how we measured and how we explored socio-economic change in the NEPSIS project, in order to explore what sort of patterns and analysis we can derive from them. And you will notice a pattern here. That whenever we've come across a difficult question and difficult data analysis to do, then we've thrown up our hands and run around the room shouting, "Help! What on earth do we do?" And then Kelvin and Caleb have come along and helped us out. So the solution to all our problems, in fact, I would suggest any research problem, is probably likely to be called Gallemore, and certainly Caleb and Kelvin together. And I'm very much looking forward to discussants today. We have Emmanuel Sulle, who is as ever, a tremendous privilege to work with. He is the first successful doctoral candidate at PLUS to complete his work through publications, and one of those researchers who became Amianzu Daktari Kablaku Pata Daktari work. You know, he's been a qualified doctoral researcher for a very, very long time, and it's a privilege to have him with us. And Toraibe Benjaminsen barely needs much introduction in this room. He's a world-leading political ecologist who's been working on issues of Tanzanian wildlife management, natural resource management, in fact, far broadly than Tanzania. And it's a great privilege, Tor, to have you with us, and thank you very much indeed for joining. What I want to do is explain, with Caleb, of course, in this presentation, the approach that we took into exploring socioeconomic change, and then Caleb will explain the sorts of answers that we got. And the approach that we took has been structured by the findings of the parallel project that Christine and I were working on when we were trying to understand long-term change in Tanzanian societies. And we discovered that when we're looking at particularly data to do with poverty and wealth, the poverty line data in Tanzania don't count the things that matter, which may sound a bold claim, but the thing is that poverty line data in Tanzania are based on measurements of what people buy during the week. They're based on consumption diaries. And these consumption diaries count everything that is spent, whether it's on education, on food, on heating, on charcoal, on wood, on electricity, on household expenditure. And these elements are poverty lines. And there are very simple and good reasons for this, is that if you have a shop and you buy goods for your shop and you put them in your shop to sell, then when you buy those goods, those are not your household expenditure, that's not your household consumption, that's your business consumption. And if I was to measure someone's consumption and they were buying a lot of shampoo for their pharmacy, they would look quite wealthy because they're spending a lot of money on shampoo. But it's not money that they spend on themselves, it's money which goes into their business. And exactly the same principle counts with farmers, with farms, that if you are spending money on buying land or oxen or ploughs or, as is written here, inputs such as fertilizer or seed for pembejeo kilimo, for agricultural goods, you don't count that expenditure. And that's the second problem, though, because it is precisely that expenditure which is omitted from poverty lines which counts enormously in local definitions of wealth. This is a statement from one of the Kilwa groups, and I'm very grateful. I think it was Pili who helped to translate this, because there were bits of it which I could not follow. But this is a statement that came up in one of the groups that we were doing, which explained that when people get money in these groups, it doesn't go into weekly consumption. You don't start frittering this money away in normal consumption needs. You invest in things. People are investing in TVs or in solar panels, and which means that they don't have very much ready money around with them. They get a single or a couple of inputs of money during the season, and then they make sure that goes to useful investments. And as you can see down the bottom, that if you get the money, then you spend it on things like a TV, on things like a plot, or bricks for your house. In other words, you're putting this into assets which can become productive later, and this isn't counted in the poverty line data, in measurements of poverty. So this means assets both matter a great deal in terms of local definitions of wealth, but also cannot be reliably captured with existing data. And here we can see just some indication of precisely how important assets are in determining measures of wealth. I hope that you can see that on the screen, but you should be able to see that there are the top 3 wealth groups of people who are extremely rich this is in Hanang, in central Tanzania. And they are rich because of the assets they own, because they own large-scale non-farm assets, as you can see from the 4th line in the column on the right. Because of they own, in the 2nd line, significant assets and local power. So these are local definitions of wealth. If we move down to the very bottom line on the right-hand side, you can see that it says that people who are destitute, who depend upon others for basic needs, or a few lines up, they have no clear livelihood source and no significant productive assets. Poverty is determined by your lack of herds of land and your lack of ability to use your land. However, this introduces the methodological problem which has us running to Caleb for help. Because if assets are important, and they are, and if the important assets vary from place to place, which they will do, then how broadly can we compare assets from village to village? If we compare assets on the coast and we find that boats and fishing lines and fishing nets are very important, when we go inland and find that in a place with no coastal access and no lakes and no rivers that people don't have nets and boats, does that make them poor? I would think it would make them sensible. But equally then, what sorts of assets are valued in every place, and which sorts of assets are varied locally? How can we come up with an index which provides for commensurability, for comparative measurement from place to place? And this is very hard to construct, and in fact this is actually where I understand the research cutting edge is, because the current use of assets at a national scale is to take a large asset database, such as those provided by the Demographic and Health Survey data, and one conducts a principal component analysis to look for axes of difference within those asset ownership bundles to see what differentiates the population according to assets. But this assumes that all assets are equally valuable and are equally valued from place to place, which is not a safe assumption. And furthermore, it tends to bring out the differences that in urban areas you've got electricity and in rural areas you haven't, which doesn't really tell us about wealth. And you end up with a bunch of assets that are important, which includes, as I recall, I think there are 6 of them. There's radios, fridges, there is access to electricity, there is car ownership. There are a whole set of things which have never really mattered in any of the villages I've lived in within Tanzania. So they introduce, I think, a difference between urban and rural areas. They don't help us to understand differences in rural differentiation, which is what we're trying to seeking to do here. And these, in fact, are the simplified asset indices, which you can then take from country to country. If you look at, in order to see the difference between Bangladesh, Benin, and Tanzania. Television, radio, irons, some measures of house construction in Tanzania, as you can see on the right-hand column, and then the source of energy, of lighting in your household, and whether somebody has a bank account. I mean, when I think of my neighbours in Hanang, or the people I live with in Rukwa, there's nobody with a bank account at all. This is not a good measure of differentiation. And this is the cutting edge that Deborah Johnston and Alexandra Breu have come up with, having criticised this use of assets, that they insist that indices must be constructed and compared over limited time periods and scales, that they have to be based on asset choices which are meaningful locally. And straight away bank accounts will go out of the picture. And we have to have a careful understanding of the relationship between the assets used and the sorts of well-being which are measured. And it's these second two challenges which we've tried to take on in the NEPSIS data. And precisely how we do that gets really, really interesting, but instantly far beyond my own ability to tell you about. But fortunately, because you have a Caleb who's able to do this for us, and Caleb, this is your cue. Please do tell me that you can hear me and you can you can talk. Otherwise, the next 20 minutes of this presentation are going to be very, very awkward.
All right, I am here. So thank you for the exaggeratedly positive introduction. I got really lucky to have Dan come to me with a fun puzzle to work on, and came up with working together with the other folks in NEPSIS. We've gone through a whole bunch of different iterations, and I think we finally got to something that might maybe work, maybe. So that's sort of my level of confidence in it. But I think to make it easier, Dan, I'm just going to take over sharing screen now, and I'll just run the slides from my end so I can just move them. So then, everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
There. Okay. So kind of building off of Dan's insights about the limitations of poverty measures, particularly for the places that we're looking at in NEPSIS, we have this sort of comparison of how do you identify wealth and affluence when the sorts of things that you would invest in if you had wealth and affluence are going to be potentially quite heterogeneous, especially given that by design the NEPSIS project is set up to compare folks that are in sort of different types of productive rural regions, right? And so that brings us to what Dan was saying about the importance of context. And so we've basically, from the survey design, are using an understanding of assets where they're a possession that can be used to generate a flow of income, and there are also houses. The houses part seems a little tacked on, but it is a clearly important indicator of things that folks invest in for their long-term well-being. So to get you a little bit of a sense of how the study villages compare to sort of Tanzania as a whole, this is just some simple bar plots that are showing all of our study area, so like all of the study villages under NEPSIS, compared to the 2012 national census in terms of a few different household characteristics and a couple other assets that are found both in the NEPSIS survey and in the 2012 census. This gives us a little bit of context for the region. So, I mean, it tends to be the case that the NEPSIS study villages are generally a little bit less affluent than the sort of mean village in the national census. So here, if you can think about this, this is the percentage of households across all of Tanzania in the national, the darker bar that have these different household characteristics. And then the lighter bar is the percentage of households in our study area. And so you can see things like the national census households are a little more likely to have cement floors, households in the study area are much more likely to have much more likely to have mud walls than anything else compared to the national level. More likely to have grass roofs than.
Caleb, just a moment. I'm afraid that we can't see the bottom axis on your slides again.
Okay.
If you could just explain what they say, that will be fine for the people in the room.
Okay. Let me. I need to reshare. Hold on.
It's just because the Zoom toolbar button along the bottom.
It keeps cutting off the bottom, doesn't it? Okay, gotcha.
But if you just tell us what the axes are, then that'll be one way around it.
All right. So here we've got folks with grass roofs versus iron roofs, right? And so we have a greater proportion of grass roofs in the study area than what you would see in the country as a whole. Similarly, fewer televisions in the study area than what you would see in the country as a whole, though more bicycles, probably having to do with some of the things that Dan was already talking about their importance for local transportation, which would be a little bit different perhaps in other parts of the country. So we generally get a sense of an area that is less affluent probably than the national mean. And we can also compare this a little bit more regionally. So here, what we're looking at is our study villages relative to their region as recorded in the 2012 census. So now we're comparing the villages a little bit more locally. And here, we find that the villages are a little bit more similar to other villages in their region, particularly for forestry and wildlife. The coastal villages are a little bit, they tend to be a little bit different, more different from their region than some of the other ones. But, roughly speaking, the study villages appear to be relatively comparable for the most part to the rest of their regions in terms of asset profiles. So all of that basically just kind of gives us a little bit of a sense of the area. But in order to make comparisons, and one of the things that folks were asking about, of course, is, do these network complexity and institutional complexity characteristics actually make a difference in terms of people's livelihoods? Well, we need a way to measure that, right? And so this is where we put together this idea of a sort of different approach to asset indices from the propensity score analysis approach. And so it's based on three I think, fairly defensible assumptions. So assumption number one is that low value assets are going to be more common than high value assets, right? So things that are sort of relatively easy to get are going to be more prevalent across households. More households are going to have bicycles than are going to have televisions, for example. Households holding combinations of assets that would be less likely to co-occur. Okay, this is a complicated one. If assets are randomly distributed across households in the village, are more affluent than households with more common assets. So let me unpack that a little bit. So if we imagine that low value assets are more common, right? So let's say we have bicycles, and let's say we have a village of 10 households, and there are 5 bicycles in the household, or 5 bicycles in the village, right? So if you imagine that those bicycles are just randomly distributed across households, you pick any one household, the probability that it has a bicycle is 1 out of 2, right? Now let's imagine that there is 1 television in the village, right? So if that television is randomly distributed across the 10 households in the village, then there's a 1 out of 10 chance, if you just pick a random household, that they're going to have a television. So what you can do then is you can look for, if we are assuming that the higher value assets are going to be less common, then the households that have combinations of the least common assets are going to be more likely to be the more affluent households. right? So if you have a household that has both a bicycle and a television, then the probability of that occurring by random chance is 1 out of 2 in the case of the bicycle and 1 out of 10 in the case of the television. So 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 10 is 1 out of 20, right? So that's the probability that you would have that combination by random chance. And the basic idea here is that then you can extend this to all of the different assets that we have information about. And that's going to be flexible enough to capture variations in what types of assets are valued. Because whether the most important asset is, say, a tractor or fishing gear in a given village, if it is a high value asset, it's going to be one of the least probable assets to find in the village, right? Because there are going to be fewer households that have it. And so if we can think of these things in terms of the probability that this household has the particular assets that it has by random chance, then that gives us a measure of sort of how unusual, or in this case, we're interpreting this as how affluent the household is. Now, there are some complexities here in that there's nothing built into those assumptions that tells us the probability is going to map onto wealth. We just think it should. And so one of the things that we've done is sort of use this measure to calculate probabilities of observing different households, and then looking at what their assets look like. And it does seem to sort of pass sort of qualitative expectations. So here's how we actually do the calculation. So for every single household in a village, we calculate that probability that they would have their combination of assets if all the assets in the village were just randomly distributed across households, right? So that gives us a measure of their uniqueness in the village. Then we take each household in that data set and we imagine moving them to every other village in the study and keep doing the calculation. So here what we're doing is we're actually incorporating information about the valued assets in other villages so that we can compare what's going on across our study villages. Then we take all that and we take the mean of all those values for every household. And once we have that, so we have a measure of basically the uniqueness of each household across the entire set of villages, while respecting the actual structure of the village to incorporate information on local context. We can then compute the standard deviation of all those values across villages for every single household. And so that gives us a sense of, like, when you move a household from one village to another, how unstable is the probability measure? So if the measure's good, it should be relatively stable across villages, right? And the more stable it is across villages, the better our case that we're actually getting at something that is a comparable dimension of wealth, right? And so then you can just plot the histogram of those standard deviations, and then you can visually inspect the individual sources of high standard deviations, right? So you're basically looking to see, are there certain villages where if you move households out of that village, all of a sudden their asset index measure just goes haywire, right? Because if it does, then that suggests that we're sort of breaking some underlying dimension of context that's determining what assets are valued. And so that gives you sort of an iterative way to construct a comparable index that has more local contextual validity. So in our case, it turns out the measure is very stable across villages, pretty much because what we assumed does seem to be the case, that the most valuable assets, so your fishing gear, your metal grooves, things like that, are actually rare everywhere. So when you move a household with valuable assets from one village to another, even if the valuable asset is different, there's still an unusual household in that village. And if you move a lower, a household with lower resources into another village, they turn out about the same as well, because at the low end, the differentiation between assets happens in this case primarily at the upper level of wealth, right? So again, the context that's determining what are the most desirable assets really starts making a difference for the highest value assets. And so that actually, in this case, seems to make the measure very stable. So we can then use that measure to try to compare the different villages in terms of these livelihood outcomes. And so one thing that we can't do in this case, because we only have one round of data collection, is we can't deal with the sort of selection effect problems that we talked about in the last presentation when we were talking about environmental outcomes. So sort of causal claims here, but these associations are sort of telling. So what's interesting here is, so if we look at across all the data sets, we do find that villages that are in simple partnership areas seem to, on average, have a little bit lower score on the livelihoods index than other villages. However, that finding is driven almost entirely by the coastal case. So in the coastal case, there is a substantial difference in livelihoods between villages that are in IMBREM and villages that are outside of IMBREM that are operating PMUs. We don't see any other systematic differences in forestry or in wildlife. So that's an interesting and sort of potentially puzzling outcome that whose interpretation I think is best left up to folks focusing on the coastal case. But we don't find substantial livelihood impacts. We do, and I've played around with this a little bit. This is not, I think, in the chapter, but if you do start breaking things down in terms of quantiles, so depending on how affluent you are, you start maybe starting to see some differences across these resource types, but we're still a little preliminary in working with that, because the new livelihoods measure seems to reflect that a little bit differently. But right now, the primary news we have is that there seems to be very little impact of livelihoods or of complexity, either of a network type or of a partnership type, on livelihoods, with the notable exception of the simple partnerships in the marine case. One thing that helps us unpack this is some more magic that Kelvin did for us, which is trying to find a way to track assets over time. And so one way that we can do this is with satellite data to sort of track the prevalence of metal roofs in different villages. And so using the sort of satellite wizardry he did before with ground truthing, there's Kelvin, for those of you who don't know him, identified metal roof areas and used Google Earth Engine to machine learn, identify them across villages. And so with that, we can start getting a little bit of a sense of maybe what's going on in some of these cases. And it does seem to be the case that there's a sort of selection effect here. And this is a really busy slide, and I realize that we're coming short on time, so I'm just going to sort of skip to the bullet point, which is that there's some evidence that we're sort of teasing through a little bit more, that it may be the case that villages that are already affluent become more capable of engaging in complex partnerships in certain situations. And that does sort of change the way we would estimate the impacts of these partnerships on livelihood. So one of the things that seems to happen is that places that are attracting complex partnerships may already have relatively, relative affluence for the area. And so as a result, affluence in those areas is just not growing as fast as it is in other areas. And it all sort of equalizes out. However, that there's still more sort of work to be done with these time series data sets. So yeah, I think that's all for right now, and I'm looking forward to hearing folks' comments on this.
Kalle, thank you very much indeed. We'll go straight to the commentary, and Sulle is coming up first, and we'll then move on to Tor. Sulle, thank you very much indeed.
Jamani, habari za mchana. Good. I'm actually surprised that I'm the only one who left the project and now discussing the project. I'm very much excited because we started together, now we are finishing together. What a lovely time. So, having read this chapter 10, and having listened to Dan trying to convince the professor of economics, that professor, we didn't cover how to make indices on measuring assets, but Ponte and Christine have done that. And actually, you're doing it here, so thank you, Dan. This is really complicated chapter. If you're just coming from the notion of land and agrarian studies, it wasn't easy. But I want to congratulate you guys for really trying to talk in a simple language on how we understand the impacts of sustainability in such a complex area. So that's really well done. But again, I want to paraphrase the question that you raise in this chapter. How do these natural resources affect their lives, livelihoods, and prosperity? I think this is a complex question that you try to answer, and it will lead to many other questions that I have. But again, I also want to highlight the novelty of this study when it comes to providing how we can measure asset and make the incidences for them so that we actually expand our measures of wealth when it comes to conservation and sustainability. I think I just want to repeat a few things that actually makes and broaden our understanding, and also maybe you are rewriting, that the richer household always own the rarer resources. Dar es Salaam tunafahamu mwenye Vogue, mwenye Hama anaonekana tofauti na wengi, kwa yule ni tajiri. So I think you try to make that point very clear. But again, I have few things. I think the issues of keeping the thread together. Like when I started to read until page 90, before getting to the model, I was okay, where am I heading now? Because we are really excited about seeing when people get into this partnership of sustainability in the three sectors of wildlife, coastal resources, and forestry. Okay, what do we see? So I think bringing the idea of how do we measure from the beginning to the end will really help your chapter. And again, I think this point was raised in the morning, that most of these chapters will likely be read independently. So how do you really keep people understand, okay, natural resource governance is always a common term that is used, but not very much understood, because it actually comprises the institutions, the norms in which natural resources are governed and communities participate and they benefit from that. So that what we are looking here is really that. So making that very clear from the beginning makes a lot of sense. And I think you also bring the issues of elite capture very clearly here, that the minority are probably benefiting from these natural resources. But again, from these discussions, it's very clear to me, as someone who has worked with others like Ian Schoons, it clearly comes, it boils down to winners and losers, something I'm sure most of you haven't used. But if you really look into your study, it shows a lot about social differentiations. The affluent villages, the affluent people are likely to engage with investment in tourism. These are the ones that will build lodges will hotels, they will buy car hiring in the next 20 years, then these are the winners and the losers are the majority. And the losers are the ones whose crops are destroyed by elephants, or the losers are the livestock keepers whose goats, cattle are attacked by lions. I think some of these, it's complicated because we all come from different backgrounds, but actually some readers will want to see that kind of connections, because clearly what you are showing here is a social differentiation and class dynamics and power relations, how they feature in these kinds of partnership. But again, when you try to compare what you're finding in southern Tanzania and clearly showing that these are kindly poor in comparison to the northern part of Tanzania or elsewhere, then you are bringing other whims of cultural norms, religious issues. How do that affect our own growth and our own priorities? Because as you clearly say that the wealth assets are context specific. What people in the south put as a priority might not something that people in Morogoro put as a priority, which you clearly show. But then when we look into this comparison, I think we need to bring some other aspects that are also complicated, and I have no answer to that. But it's a part of the comparative analysis that you guys are showing, and clearly you have a lot of data to show it. So maybe the other factors that you can look at from the perception, from people like PhD students who have been living in those areas, what are the perception of people? What makes development very poor in the area? That 1 minute is not true. But again, I also want to really bring back the issue of comparing benefits from natural resources when we are looking into the outcome. Like the benefits people get from sesame and timber, I think it will be very much confusing if you say, okay, well, when we farm sesame, we get more money. That's exactly economically true, but in terms of the wealth and the other, what do we call ecosystem payments or benefit that people get from forestry is much more sustainable, while these other things are perishable or they can end, because these areas are also not very fertile to the extent that if they cultivate for about 20 years, they will get the same yield. And I think you can run into that kind of challenge. So again, two final things is actually you maybe also be benefiting from looking into the political economy factors of why these areas are not benefiting from the natural resources. What policies and legal frameworks are actually hindering from communities to tapping into the benefits coming from natural resources. And again, finally done, when you compare houses, we are also getting into the trouble of what house is more preferred depending on the geographic, on the climatic conditions. When someone comes to my house in the village, they prefer to go into the grasses roof because it's more comfortable, and the tourist hotels are actually not iron roofed because of comfortability. So very complex stuff, and because you always forced me to leave, let me just go, Professor. Asante sana.
Sulle, thank you so much. We'll be responding to some of those comments shortly. That was wonderful. Tor, you're up now.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Very nice to see you all. Sorry I can't be with you, but it's nice to join you virtually. It looks like you're having a nice conference, although I have only been able to follow the part of the previous session and this session. So yeah, and it's also nice to be able to follow the Nepsis project at a distance. I was actually one of the reviewers of the proposal, and I've also been a discussant at the session at the AHG conference once, and I've also read your stuff that you have published, or at least some of the stuff. So it has been very nice to follow this project at a distance. Now, on this particular chapter, I must say that I'm not an economist. I'm not able to go into the the details of the methodology as such, but it's nice to see that the work that was published now in the book that I understand was launched in Dar es Salaam a couple of days ago, that work continues, because I think that's very important and great stuff. Very important research, potentially very important both academically and in terms of policy impact. So it has, I think, the potential of changing how we see rural development and African small-scale farming. So thank you very much for that work, actually. I'm actually, even though I'm not able to go into the details of the methods, I'm probably one of, or maybe your biggest fan, although an uncritical fan. But I think because of the importance of this work, I think it's great. And I think it also holds, as far as I can understand, it holds methodologically. Now, so my comment would be more on, well, first of all, perhaps one comment on the methods. I like the way you use Google Earth images combined with ground truthing. I didn't know that you could actually get historical images from Google Earth, and I would be interested to know which years you combine, because I didn't see that in the chapter. And I would also like to know more about how you actually access historical Google Earth images. I think that could even be mentioned in the chapter. So my main comment would rather be on the writing, because I think there is a need for much more context and explanation here in the way you write about this. I know that this is chapter 10, and there is probably a lot of context given already in the previous chapters, but anyway, I think there needs to be a bit more context and more explanation of the statements, because you have a rather technical, economistic language here, and I think lay readers like me need to get an explanation what these statements actually mean. For instance, you have a sentence saying something about the relationship. You say that the relationship between network complexity and asset scores breaks down at the lower asset ownership levels. I think I sense what that means, but I think in order to ease reading, you need to put that into a context and say what that means in practical terms in relation to real life in a village. And there are a number of statements like that around, pages 191, 92. So that's mainly my comment, that I think there needs to be, more translation of these findings into a more accessible language, basically. Otherwise, it's great stuff, and I'm your biggest fan. Thank you very much.
Tor, thank you very much indeed. I want to, before I take questions, and I will be doing that in a moment, I do want to give a chance for Caleb and myself to respond to some of the points that discussants have made, and then we're going to go around the room taking questions. So please keep your questions brewing for the time being. And Caleb, I was going to ask you if you had any... No, I'm not going to put you on the spot, Caleb. I've put you on the spot pretty much ever since I've met you. I've got one. Let me come up with one or two responses to things I've heard, and then I'll pass over to you to give you time to reflect on this. To both discussants, just thank you so much for the work you put into this and for these thoughts and reflections. These are very well taken, and it's particularly useful to have somebody who knows the place and the methods and ideas so well for you to say you're not explaining it well enough. That counts, and we will be listening to that. And Sulle, you made a couple of points which I'd like to respond to, because I think they are very important. The first, you were questioning the relationship between assets and prosperity. If you chop down your trees to grow sesame, you may suffer in other forms of prosperity die afterwards because you've lost trees. That was the point you were making, I think. If so, it is, I think, an essential one. It in fact underpins our whole approach, is that you cannot assume that assets correspond to wealth. And you have to look at the relationship between different asset bundles and different forms of prosperity empirically, because this will vary from place to place. And what the point that you made about house type and wealth was also fascinating, because you were pointing out that a metal roof in a hot country is uncomfortable, and a grass roof can be much more comfortable. That's what I heard you say, Sulle. And I get that, and I agree with it. And when I was in Rukwa in Mtawisa doing this long-term study and looking at the changes, I was asking people pretty much exactly the same question. Why is everyone investing in metal roofs? Surely it's just going to be miserable. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was walking past a house where there's a lot of activity and people were cleaning it up, and I realized in fact that what had happened was that the grass roof had just burnt down that night. And so the people I was talking to laughed at me, because I'm bringing in my old English values where a thatched roof house is actually a mark of prestige. In Rukwa it's not, and the values work differently. I mean, your fundamental point, Sulle, is absolutely right, that what is valued as a good house will vary from place to place. But the reasons why a metal roofed house were valued in Mtawisa were firstly because there's less fire risk, secondly because it's harder to break through and steal things from, thirdly because there's less vermin in it, and fourthly, and this was really interesting, is that those first three risks can be catered for, can be coped with. But these days there's much less thatching grass. The cattle have come through and they're eating it all. There's more forest than there was before, and so thatching grass availability is much less. And people instead will use reeds from the lake, which last 1 to 2 years, or rice grass, which lasts only a year. And so the old thatching grass, which lasted for 5 years, less available, much more expensive. And so it's actually, even though it's less comfortable, it is more convenient to have this metal roof. But the point is that what is valued as a good house is entirely context specific, and we have to be sensitive to that. So that again, I hope I heard you. Those are the 2 points I wanted to say. Caleb, can we come to you? Then we have Lasse and Estebe with questions, and I'll be going around the room as well for questions too.
Yeah, so thank you both for those comments. They're, again, really helpful for us, and I agree 100% with the clarification questions. I don't really have too much, I think, to add, other than I can just do a quick clarification about the Google Earth and sort of how that was all done, because I did sort of rush through that a bit. So Kelvin was actually going village to village, and so you saw in some of the images where he was basically mapping out where metal roofs were for the ground truthing. Then what he would do is each individual village, he would find a, pretty sure he was using Landsat image that was of adequate resolution, no cloud cover, all those ideal conditions to do that sort of machine learning. And so the years, so we would have 2 years for each village, but the years differed slightly from village to village depending on the image availability, right, and whether or not there was cloud cover. So most of the time, the images are from sort of mid to late 2000s for the first time period, and then 2017 or 2018 for the most recent time period. And so basically what we had to do was to try to calculate essentially an estimated rate of change between the two images for each individual village. And there were a few villages for which he just, there weren't good images that he could use. So we dropped, I think, 3 or 4 villages in the process. But as far as accessing historical imagery, Google Earth Engine, which is their sort of programming system that they've built to do a lot of this stuff in the cloud, is really great for that. And you can even access it just looking at sort of the regular Google Earth app. There's just a little button hidden on the app that looks like a clock. And if you click on it, it pulls up a timeline of all the available imagery in the view shed. And so you can actually walk it back in time. It's really good for classes. I use it a lot for that. So yeah, that's all. Again, thank you both for the comments.
And it wasn't at all frustrating for me to realize that the painstaking counting of roofs by hand that I did in Umtuisa, Kelvin did in about 10 seconds using his algorithm. Lasse, you're up first, and then Estebe for your questions, and then I'll be going around the room.
Thank you. This is incredibly fascinating work. Thank you so much. I did have a question, and then maybe more of a reflection leading to a question. So first of all, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what might be explanations for the higher than average affluence of the coastal area, which was how I interpreted the graph, because we could see that the forest areas and the wildlife areas were significant explanations for that. And then all affluence of simpler partnerships. I was wondering about, because you're focusing on affluence, right? And you're finding these sort of rare assets that signal affluence across context. And I think that's brilliant. But I was wondering about whether the more usual assets, whether the absence of usual assets or high probability assets could also signal, say, poverty. So I guess my question is, like, you're focusing on the top end distribution, but is there information in this data to identify the bottom end as well? And so, yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lasse. Estebe, your hand is up as well.
Yes, thank you very much. So I have a very specific question or suggestion. But first, I would like to do a little bit of a philosophical comment for everyone to think about. I don't have an answer myself, but it's just a reflection. So when in the previous section we were trying to analyze environmental outcomes, there was this inherent process of simplification about ecological data that ecologists may have been very concerned about, and the simplification was, we looked at areas which they were, well, but actually we have very different types of forested areas. Some may have more complex structures. Maybe the forested areas in one part of the country are different than in another part of the country. And you may have more or less biodiversity within these forests. How you are making such simplification for the sake of, of doing these analysis of whether environmental outcomes are realized or not. And here we are when we come to the sort of socioeconomic dimension in which we are not able to do that simplification. Or it seems that if we attempt to do that with metal roofs, then we see all these problems, which in a way we are not seeing for the environmental outcome. So this is a bit of my kind of philosophical reflection. And then the question is whether you tried to look at quantity and density of phone use as a potential indicator of simplification of economic wealth. And the reason why I'm telling that, I've been trying to find a reference, but I recently read parts of this book called Bit by Bit, which is a book about how to use big data in social research. And I remember they mentioned this, but I couldn't find the reference. They mentioned this study in Rwanda, where they basically overlapped country poverty data with all the problems it may have done with the use of phones across the country. And actually they found a very strong correlation between the presence of mobile phones and the use of mobile phones with poverty data. So that would be my concise question. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Esteban. Before we respond to those, are there any questions in the room that I can take? Karibu-san. Questions and comments, Karibu-san.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to give a small comment about the asset part. For example, I'm coming from Zanzibar, and so my examples would be from coastal villages of Unguja Island. I just want to mention about the issue of telephones. Personally, I'm a marine scientist, but I've been working on social issues for a long time, like people with Josh Sina and so on and so forth. And when you go to the villages, you'll be surprised. Almost 90% they own telephones. And you'll be amazed, even me with a PhD and a lot of salary, I have a small phone, they have the big ones, like these ones. So you are wondering how the house, it is